Welcome to the 2-2 review video, everyone. Remember the basic questions we're answering with this set of poems and short essays is how do these relate to sustainability, mainly to the issue of social justice and sustainability. Remember, those are the two arms of sustainability that I'd like you to remember. And we always think of resources like water, food, land, agriculture, overpopulation, those type of things. But remember, we're talking about social justice too, and how empowered are people, how much control do they have over their environment. We can think of that specifically as, a polluted versus unpolluted environment, but we might just think of the social environment as well. Are people equal? Right? Are people equal or not? That's part of sustainability. Because as we know from our early readings, it leads to environmental problems when people do not have enough power. Okay, and the other thing that we're looking at here coincides with social justice, and that is simply, are people defined as natural, and does that empower them or work against them, right? And so those are our big issues, sustainability and being defined as the natural. Let's leap right into Amy Lowell's patterns. Lowell, a very well-known poet from early 20th century, also a relative of poet, very famous poet as well, Robert Lowell, from the 1950s and 60s, if you're curious. So this poem, Patterns, I thought this would be easiest to approach maybe by just answering some questions. I think the poem is easy enough to read and lends itself to a basic interpretation, and we can start to respond to questions of sustainability and being defined as the natural or as nature, maybe by asking some questions first, and we can look at the evidence from the poem later, and maybe that's a nice way to handle this one. One thing we might think of right away is, if you remember from the 2-1 readings, women typically disappear into the landscape. Remember all those models for the Gene ad or whatever it was? They all kind of disappeared into the landscape, and we might say is the same thing happening to her in this poem. So this poem isn't so different than that advertisement that we saw of the 5 women or so standing in the field, not really being able to do anything but sort of trapped in nature, being, associated with nature in some way, but having very little agency. And I'm going to suggest, yes, that is kind of what's happening here. We know that she's waiting on a man. We know that her dress is really, really tight. He keeps talking about how stiff her dress is as she's, about to become a lady. Then we find out that her husband-to-be has been killed in war. And so all these patterns that are represented in her dress, right? And these can be the social patterns of getting married. We know at the end it's this war is the social pattern that killed her husband. And so the bigger question becomes, does she love him? And is she now free that he's dead, or did she lose freedom through him, right? Those would be the interpretations. It's kind of back to this big question. Does she love him? And did he represent freedom, or did he represent sort of entrapment and social patterns that would put her on the inferior end of the relationship, right? Wouldn't provide her social justice or a full identity, but would rather harm her in some way and limit her in some way. And we know that she really, really likes the environment. She talks about the garden paths and the daffodils, and that's why I included it in this course. We're looking at issues of the environment, but more symbols and what they represent to her. So here's what I might say about this. Does she love him? Is he really her way out of patterns in her social roles and pretenses? I suppose that's open to interpretation. My feeling here is that by the end of the poem, she sees that all these patterns, which are really, metaphors for social roles, and her dress is a metaphor for her limitations as a woman and her limitations as a wife, that these patterns aren't very good. And so really, now that he's dead, she'll probably be more free if she can actually break beyond these patterns, these social roles. So she imagines, here's a few things that happen that support this reading. Remember, on page 2 of the poem, she imagines leading him through the flowers, right? Sort of away from the stiff war dress that he would wear as a soldier and her stiff dress. And she's leading him. She can only imagine leading him through the flowers when he comes back. That kind of makes me think we're supposed to learn that often he's leading her. She's the one that's following. She's the inferior in the relationship. She imagines leading him out into the garden, a place where she walks a lot when he's not there. It seems to give her a sense of freedom, right? So she can only imagine leading him to freedom, but in real life, they might not actually get there, right? Her actual recollections work from metaphors of stiffness, as I've talked about already. all of this tight in my stiff brocaded gown, right? And we get that over and over. That word stiff appears a lot. She seems trapped in her gown while nature flows and grows all around her. She seems to be anti-pattern by the end, as I said. He represents the pattern of war, of marriage, of proper gender roles, right? Is this poem commentary on the social roles we adopt and play out over our lives? It would seem so. She recognizes the stiffness of her dress, her role as lady and wife. She longs to run through the garden. We can just call that freedom, I think, or having no limits through social role, through her gender. She wishes to return to this role after learning of his death, right? That's what's interesting about this. She says, oh, no, I want to wear this dress and I will still wear it when I mourn. She says that down in here, in this section, as you take a look, right? I shall go up and down in my gown, gorgeously arrayed. So she's kind of connected to this role, even though it seems like it limits her as well. That's really interesting because it shows how bound we are to our social roles. It's hard to break out of them, which is true in real life as well, right? So she longs to run through the garden for freedom, even after she learns of his death, probably a habit, right, in some way. Until at the very end, she sees the war, much like her social role, as a social pattern that's played out. Okay. So is she defined as natural here? Well, she wants to be out in the garden all the time. But she's always wearing this dress. So she longs to be in nature or to have control of her environment, to be part of the environment. If she is connected with nature here at all, it's much like I think those women in the ad, in that she is limited in what she can do. Right? Even though mainly the symbol for her limitation seems to be the dress and not nature. Nature represents the longing to be free here. But she doesn't have much agency wherever she is in this landscape. What does this poem say about sustainability, resources, and then social justice? Well, that our social systems might create limitations. War is not sustainable. Even though this isn't much of a commentary on war, war we know causes eco damage, psychological harm to those that participate, the loss of mates, as we see here. So war is not good for our ecosystem. It destroys it. It destroys, reproduction, if we want to look at a loss of mate as reproduction, as well as things that humans and animals need as well. Some sort of, we could call it a spiritual sense, some psychological well-being, right? These types of things. In terms of social justice, she is clearly limited as a woman in this poem. So I've talked about a lot of evidence for it. I'll let you look through the evidence and kind of find these things in here. I've noted some lines. She wishes to lose the dress and run through the garden. So garden clearly represents freedom in these lines. I would choose to lead him along the patterned paths. As I mentioned, lines 48 and 49. She would lead him out into this sense of freedom as well, meaning that she probably doesn't get to lead him very much. And as I said, she's the inferior one. One really interesting line is line 54. In her dream, where she's leading him, she is unafraid. That almost implies that in real life, when he's around, she's afraid of him in some way, right? Or she's afraid of life, or she doesn't like her role. But this seems to be something negative that happens in her everyday life, that only in her dream, when she's running through these gardens leading him, can she be unafraid, right? One interesting moment for your interpretation, however you interpret this poem, the message arrives that he's dead. After that, we have to ask, is she sad? Or is she simply continuing the pattern, as we saw on these pages right here? I shall go up and down in my gown. But then at the end, we get what might be her moment of conversion, if you want to read it that way. What are patterns for? It could be a commentary on war, but since the whole poem was not about war and about her limitations as a woman, this has to be seen as some type of an insight into her own life, right? All right, let's move on to Kentucky, 1833. Dove's poem, Kentucky, 1833. Hopefully you know the historical context. 1833, that's about 28 years before the Civil War started, right? And so this is before any sense that slavery was bad. This is the South. And we know that this is a scene of a plantation, right, based in slavery. And so we got an easy way to look at this one, I think. We can ask, what's the conflict? Who are the main characters? The characters seem to be the community, the master here, who seems to be able to control and limit what they do, including taking away their Bible and any sense of literacy. Literacy seems to be empowerment here to try to figure out what the meaning of their life is. And the things that seem to be mysterious here, and this is why I included it in the course, seem to be the weather, the environment, the nighttime, right? um, the sky. So these are all issues related to the environment, even if they function as sort of metaphors or stand-ins for some way for spiritual meaning or the humanness, the dignity of their humanness, right? And so that's why I included it in the course. So if we want to go back then, we can look at what each stanza is doing to kind of build this conflict. Here's what we might say briefly about the first stanza. It's Sunday, a day of roughhousing. We're let out into the woods. You can see there's some control here. They are let out into the woods, right? And then we can see what looks like a really, really nice community scene. You have the young and the old all kind of relaxing in the sun and doing all these nice things. Somebody's reading from the Bible, which would have been, a major form of entertainment at the time, certainly. So the first stanza I just jotted down, fairly jubilant Sunday, also a day of spirituality. So it's setting this sense of the Bible being important. Now we can read the Bible here as not just a sense of spirituality, even though they hope to use it for that. They can't name whatever this is, this feeling in the air, and it disappears. So they're looking for spirituality, and notice that it gets closed down right away. So we can read the Bible for its sense of spirituality, but also for, much like our very first reading, its sense of social control, or its sense of how the Bible sends messages about the social divisions and hierarchies in life. It's worth mentioning, I don't know if you know this, but the Bible was, of course, used as one of the major justifications for the keeping of slaves. We can think of the civilized versus animal divide that we've talked about in the course in some way. And you can imagine how that was applied to the white race versus African Americans. But also there is the story of Ham, who was cast out and was black and was sent to Africa, and Ham had done something wrong. This is from the Old Testament. And for that, he was cursed, and all of his ancestors would serve as slaves, essentially. And so because Ham's ancestors were in Africa, this meant Africans, right, to slave owners. And so the Bible was used to justify slavery. Of course, that's a very particular reading of a very particular passage of the Bible, one story out of many stories in the Bible. And this poem kind of hints at that too, that in some way, if they could only read the Bible and find the parts that would liberate them rather than enslave them or be used as some sort of, godlike policy for enslavement, that they could be free if they could just read for themselves. So a large part of this, the connection to sustainability here, is that if they could read and it's taken away, then they could free themselves. Or at least they would know that the Bible doesn't support just that, and they could break through these social codes in what seems to be the God-given way of the world and break into a new way of seeing things. So we can see in terms of sustainability, this poem is largely about social justice, which is again why I included it. All right, so we talked about Sunday being the day of spirituality, right? The light sifts down like the finest cornmeal, God's dust. So it seems like there's something really beneficial in the environment, but then we switch to what we could call the social environment, or just what goes on this plantation. And the young boys, or probably the older boys really, are forced to fight each other, right? All of the young black men are forced to fight each other to entertain all of the white plantation owners that have gathered here. And this was actually really common. There's a really famous story called Battle Royal by Ralph Ellison that covers this as well, part of his novel Invisible Man. And so maybe you've read that or are familiar with it, but this is a really common occurrence, sadly. Interesting things going on here. In the third, then, we see that the master says that one slave is kind of like Jason, who reminds him of some sailor. It's supposed to be Jason of the Argonauts, which is a famous Greek story. So we can see here again, not only the Bible, but Greek myth used to sort of justify this behavior, this awful behavior where the boys have to fight each other. But out of it, the slave owner can feel good in that he's found a hero, a Greek hero, even though he made friends beat each other up to do that. So we see, again, the narratives of the West being used to reconcile or norm or standardize really, really awful social behaviors, right? Out of friends fighting each other comes a Greek hero, which is probably not how you see it if you're forced to fist fight your friends, right? But so we can see some commentary on both the Bible and on Greek myth here as sending misleading messages that justify social hierarchies. So that's the big thing we can see here. I have some notes to kind of justify and evidence all of these things. Maybe we'll cover them briefly in the next video, but you can look through the notes for other things that you'd like to see. All right, thank you.